Hi, I'm Priya, and I will be giving this presentation introducing my research study that I conducted with my group on the barriers faced by LGBTQ and ethnic minority individuals in accessing couples counseling. I'll give a brief background to the study, explain how it was conducted, summarize the key findings, and then focus on what they might mean for clients accessing services and what counselors can take away to incorporate in their practice. So, couples counseling is increasingly recognized as a valuable and effective way to support relationship well being. Yet, couples still seek help at lower rates than individuals do for personal mental health concerns. That gap matters because relationship distress often overlaps with stress, anxiety, and broader well being issues, and early support can prevent these problems from escalating. At the same time, barriers to help seeking aren't neutral. Even in individual therapy research, people describe obstacles such as stigma, cost, limited service availability, fear of poor outcomes, long wait lists, and uncertainty about what therapy involves. When we shift to couples counseling, those issues can become even more complex because the relationship itself is part of the client system, and both partners' willingness influences whether therapy happens. For LGBTQ and ethnic minority clients, there are additional layers. People may anticipate judgment, heteronormativity, or cultural misunderstanding in therapeutic spaces. They may have concerns about whether a therapist will get their context, whether they will be treated differently, or whether the therapy approach assumes a heterosexual or Western norm. And most importantly, most research in couples counseling has historically centered predominantly white heterosexual couples, meaning that intersectional minority perspectives are still severely underrepresented. So, the purpose of this project was to explore perceived barriers from the voices of people who sit at the intersection of sexual and cultural diversity, and to identify what those barriers mean for counseling practice and service design. The research question guiding this project was: what barriers do LGBTQ and ethnic minority individuals face when accessing couples counseling? There were three key aims. First, to identify barriers at different levels: relational barriers, cultural barriers, and service level barriers. Second, to understand how minority stress and sociocultural context shape help seeking for relationship support, specifically rather than individual therapy alone. And third, to generate applied insights that can inform counselors and services, meaning what might need to change in practice to reduce barriers. This was an exploratory qualitative study, so it wasn't designed to test a hypothesis. It was aimed to build understanding from lived experiences and perceptions and to generate themes that help explain why couples may never reach therapy or may disengage even if they do. Before moving into the findings, I'll briefly outline how the study moved from recruitment to final themes. This project used semi structured interviews and a thematic analysis approach. The method can be understood as a clear sequence. Participants were recruited, screened for eligibility, interviews were conducted and recorded, transcripts were prepared and then approved by the participants, and then the data set was coded and developed into themes. I'll keep this high level here, and then on the next slide, I'll explain the key details that mattered for understanding how the research was carried out. So, in short, recruit, interview, transcribe, approve, then analyze. Now, I'll expand on what that looked like in practice. So, this was a qualitative study with 9 participants. The recruitment was done through word of mouth and social media with an initial online questionnaire used to provide information, confirm consent, and check eligibility. The participants were included if they were 18 years or older, identified as LGBTQ, and did not identify as white or Caucasian, and had either attended, considered, or decided against couples counseling. The interviews were conducted online via Microsoft Teams and lasted around 45 to 60 minutes. Ethical safeguards were built into the process. The participants were reminded that they could pause or withdraw, and a second researcher was available on call. After interviews, transcripts were produced and returned to the participants for review, and only the transcripts that were explicitly approved were included in the final analysis. For analysis, the transcripts were converted into an intelligent verbatim format to preserve the meaning while improving readability. I then used a reflective thematic analysis approach, moving from familiarization and initial coding into developing and refining and naming themes. This produced the next 5 themes I'll summarize next. The analysis generated 5 themes, each with several sub-themes describing the perceived barriers to accessing couples counseling. The first was structural access constraints, which included cost and uneven service provision, which limited both access and choice. The second was stigma, privacy, and the help seeking threshold, including shame, secrecy, cultural taboos, limited exposure, and couples therapy being framed as a last resort. The third was trust in the therapeutic process, including mutual buy in, fear of therapist bias, psychological safety, approach fit, doubts about outcomes, and the need for contextual understanding. Fourth was minority stress and identity safety, which included heteronormativity, anticipated judgment, and the importance of visible inclusion cues. Lastly, there was cultural and family systems, including family pressure and the need for culturally competent, family aware practice. Rather than treating these as isolated factors, participants' accounts suggested that the barriers were often stacked, meaning they interact across different stages of help seeking, which becomes central to the discussion. A helpful way to interpret the findings is to view access not as a single moment, like deciding to book therapy, but as a staged pathway. At different points in that pathway, different barriers become dominant. Some barriers appear before a couple ever contacts a service, such as stigma, secrecy, and assumptions about who the therapy is for. Other barriers emerge at the decision stage, particularly the fact that couples therapy requires mutual agreement. Then, even if a couple reaches therapy, continued engagement depends on whether the process feels safe, fair, culturally relevant, and worthwhile. So, the contribution here is not only identifying barriers, but showing how barriers can stop people at different stages. Meaning, some couples never even reach the point where practical barriers like cost become relevant because they disengage earlier due to identity safety concerns or help seeking shame. Before contacting services, participants describe barriers that shaped whether couples counseling even felt like an option. One key factor was stigma and shame. The idea that needing relationship support could be embarrassing or interpreted as personal failure. This created an internal conflict, wanting support but fearing what it meant to admit that the relationship needs help. A second factor was privacy management. Several participants described not wanting to disclose their relationship difficulties to their family and sometimes not even to friends because disclosure could invite judgment, interference, or cultural pressure. In those cases, couples counseling was not just a personal decision, it was tied to concerns about social consequences and maintaining boundaries between the couple and the wider family system. A third factor was cultural taboo. The belief that personal matters should remain private or that counseling is unnecessary unless something is seriously wrong. This links to the help seeking threshold finding. Couples counseling was frequently framed as an endpoint or a last resort rather than proactive support. Finally, exposure and framing mattered. Participants said that they rarely encountered couples counseling discussed openly. Some had never even seen advertising or public conversation about couples counseling. Others had negative exposure, such as observing couples who attended counseling and later separated, or observing negative experiences within their family, making them hesitant to engage. In short, before any practical barriers arise, many couples are already negotiating whether therapy is socially acceptable, safe to disclose, or worth the vulnerability. Once couples consider therapy, two major barriers shape whether they can get to the door. The first is structural feasibility. Cost was described not just as expensive, but as a high stakes investment, especially when therapy outcomes felt uncertain and when the sessions were not covered by insurance. Uneven service provision also mattered. Participants described how living outside major cities can reduce choice. Importantly, lack of choice isn't just inconvenient, it intensifies worries about whether the service they do find will be inclusive, culturally competent, and a good match. The second barrier is what I describe as dyadic gatekeeping. Couples therapy requires that both partners agree to attend and engage. Participants describe situations where one partner was willing to seek help and the other was not. This means that access can be blocked at the negotiation stage, before cost or availability even comes into play. And the negotiation itself can create relational tension, especially if one partner interprets therapy as blame, failure, or exposure. So, getting to the door is partly structural. Can we access it? And partly relational. Can we agree to access it? Both are necessary and both can block help seeking. Even when couples reach therapy, participants describe barriers that influence whether they stay engaged. A core issue was trust in the process. Some participants worry that the therapist might take sides or appear biased towards one partner. That fear undermines safety because couples therapy requires vulnerability from both partners. And if one partner expects judgment or imbalance, they may disengage or become defensive. Participants also emphasize psychological safety, the need to feel understood, respected, and not judged. Some express concerns about how the therapist would handle their information, how private disclosures would be received, interpreted, or used in session. Another barrier was approach fit. Participants preferred therapy that felt flexible and human, rather than rigid or overly structured. Fit wasn't described as purely technical, it was relational. A mismatched approach could make therapy feel robotic, uncomfortable, or ineffective. Finally, value and outcomes mattered. Because therapy requires time, emotional energy, and money, uncertainty about whether it would help, especially in early sessions, could discourage continuation. So, staying engaged depends on whether therapy feels safe, neutral, relevant, and worth the investment. Across the pathway, identity and cultural context shape the perceived risk of therapy. Participants describe minority stress processes such as anticipated judgment, which is the fear of being treated differently, misunderstood, or viewed as abnormal. They also describe couples counseling as potentially heteronormative, imagined as designed for heterosexual couples, raising concerns that LGBTQ relationships might not be understood or treated equivalently. Importantly, these concerns often operate before therapy began, through what we can call an identity safety screening. Participants describe wanting visible signs that a therapist or service is welcoming and competent with diverse clients before they would feel comfortable contacting a service. Inclusion cues were described not as marketing but as a practical way to reduce uncertainty and avoid rejection. Cultural context was also central. Participants described family pressure and cultural norms shaping not only the relationship stress itself, but the help seeking decision. How safe it feels to disclose, whether counseling is acceptable, and how family involvement might complicate access. For some couples, the fear was not simply will therapy help, but what happens if our families find out? Or will the therapist understand the cultural pressures we navigate? This is why cultural competence is described as needing to be family aware and contextual, not just generic sensitivity. Participants wanted therapists who could engage with the cultural norms and family systems and still provide guidance that felt relevant and functional. Based on these findings, there are three practical takeaways for counselors and services. First, signal safety early. Because many barriers operate before contact, public facing materials matter. Participants wanted visible cues of inclusion, statements, representation, affirming language on websites, forms, profiles, leaflets, and first contact communications. This helps clients assess whether therapy is likely to be safe before taking the risk of reaching out. Second, contract clearly. Early sessions should explicitly address neutrality and confidentiality. This includes naming how you manage taking sides concerns, how you hold fairness in the room, and how information will be handled. That kind of early contracting reduces uncertainty and builds trust. Third, work contextually. Practitioners should explore culture, family involvement, minority stress, and privacy concerns as part of formulation rather than treating them as add ons. This means asking questions like what makes it feel safe or unsafe to talk about this? Or how does family involvement shape what you can disclose? Or what would an affirming therapy space look like for you? Or have you had any concerns about judgment or misunderstanding in professional spaces? These implications also point to service level strategies, increasing representation and diversity amongst practitioners, improving access and transparency, and ensuring that inclusivity is embedded in the service system, not just in individual therapists' goodwill. A useful way to summarize this slide is barriers aren't only about whether therapy exists, they're also about whether service looks safe, relevant, and trustworthy from the outside in. Before concluding, I want to briefly acknowledge the limitations and future directions. Although all participants identified as LGBTQ, many participants were in opposite gender relationships, which may mean that sexuality related barriers do not feel as immediately salient for them as they might have for same sex couples. In addition, minority diversity in the sample was uneven. For example, several participants shared similar cultural backgrounds, so future research should aim to recruit a broader spread of minority identities. Future work could build on the study in three ways. Firstly, to recruit more same sex couples and explore whether identity safety, heteronormativity, and anticipated judgment play a stronger role in help seeking decisions. Secondly, they can interview both partners where possible to capture the dyadic negotiation process directly rather than relying on just one partner's account. Lastly, it could compare anticipatory barriers, which is what people fear before attending, with the in therapy barriers reported by couples who are currently in counseling to understand what changes once people cross the threshold into services. To conclude, this study suggests that barriers to couples counseling for LGBTQ and culturally diverse clients operate across a help seeking pathway and can stack at different stages. For many participants, the decision to access therapy was shaped not only by cost or availability, but by stigma, privacy concerns, mutual partner willingness, and the need for therapy to feel safe, neutral, inclusive, and culturally relevant. The take home message for counselors is straightforward. Access improves when clients can see, before they even attend, that its service is welcoming and competent, when therapists contract clearly around safety and neutrality, and when cultural and family systems are treated as part of the clinical reality rather than a side issue. In short, for many minority clients, the question isn't only does couples counseling exist, but is the space for us? Lastly, these are the key references underpinning the background and interpretation of the study. A complete reference list is included in the dissertation. Thank you.